Hey everybody, welcome back to the channel. Thank you for tuning in. This week I'm going to continue with my theme of doing some maintenance on the GTR by doing the spark plugs. For those of you who saw last week's video, I did an oil change on it and I showed the little tips and tricks there, as well as ran some seafoam cleaner through the engine to kind of clean it out, and it does feel like the car is running a little bit smoother. For those of you who didn't see that video, I'm going to go ahead and leave a link above my head and down in the description down below so you can check it out if you want to. I know what you're thinking though, spark plugs, typically not that hard nor that interesting. When you take a look at some of my other cars like the Supra or the R35 GTR, all you had to do is remove a cover, the coils right there along with the spark plugs, and you were good to go. However, for some reason, Nissan decided to make it a little bit more complicated on the R35. They put the entire intake manifold over the spark plugs, which means I gotta get that entire thing out of there to even get to the spark plugs, and I'll show you how to go through all of that. All right, before we get started, I did want to give you a few things you want to know before you start digging in. One of the things is you're going to need to pick up a tool because a lot of people don't have this as part of their kit already, and that is an inch-pound torque wrench. A lot of people have foot-pound torque wrenches, but a lot of people do not have the inch-pound torque wrench. And this is very important because we're dealing with a lot of aluminum items, and you do not want your righty-tighty to become a lefty-loosey, because then it becomes a very expensive project. The other thing you're going to want to pick up is some towels or some tape. The reason why is because we're taking off the intake manifold that's going to expose the engine, and you're going to want to stuff something in there to make sure you don't accidentally drop your 10mm down that hole, because then that's a whole nother issue. The other thing you want to know too is you want to pay attention to the year of your car. I am very lucky because if you look right here on my throttle body, there's some ports. Now on some years of cars, and I believe it is the CBAs, which ran from 09 to 2011, there's actually water tubes that run through there. That makes things more complicated because you can't just take everything off unless you want to open up your water lines, and then you have to worry about bleeding your water system later. Or you have to take the throttle bodies off of the intake manifold before you take it out of the car. Fortunately, like I said, I don't have those water passages, which means this is going to be a lot easier, but if you're going to do the spark plugs on your car, make sure you take a look and see if you have those. So one of the first things we're going to do is disconnect the battery, just because we're going to be disconnecting some sensors and dealing with the spark plug. So as you can see, the battery just sits right underneath that tray, properly labeled battery, and I'm just going to disconnect the ground real quick. As a note, before you take this off, make sure you've gotten everything out of the trunk that you're going to need, because once you have no power to the car, you're not going to be able to open your trunk. Just kind of tuck that out of the way. Now there's no power to the system, and we're ready to get moving. The first thing we got to do is we got to take off this little cover right here. Real simple, just 4 bolts, 6mm Allen, and we're just going to have to crack these loose, which are pretty darn easy, and then take them out. Well, now that we got the cover off the intake manifold, it's time to get these rubber hoses out of the way. You can use a flathead screwdriver. I'm kind of more of a fan of using the socket wrench. It looks like it's a 7mm. So we're just going to loosen these up and then just try and get these rubber couplings off. There it goes.
There we go.
There we go. Now that we got the couplers off, now for the really fun part of the job, and that's finding all the hoses and things that are connected to the intake manifold and getting them disconnected before we take this thing off. We got hoses here, we have sensors that are bolted to it, like right here and right here. The harness is clipped to it, so we're gonna have to make sure that's free and clear. So this is where the majority of the work is gonna be. Okay, so as a note, the plastic zip tie that holds the harness to the back of the manifold, if you use a flathead, you can get it in there and just kind of lift up with the tab and it will come clear. Okay, so I think we've got all of the hoses and all the electrical connectors disconnected from the intake manifold. We're gonna take the bolts out and see if that's the case. If we find anything else as we lift it up, we'll disconnect it then. There is actually a specific order you do wanna take these bolts out. You wanna start back here with one, come to the front here too, and then just kind of make a crisscross pattern to get all of the bolts out. And in that way you've relieved the pressure equally. All right, now that we actually got the entire intake manifold off, we're past the hard part. You can actually see the coil packs that are right here. And this is what we needed the shop towels for. You definitely want to take all the shop towels you have and stuff them in these runners, because you definitely don't want to lose anything down those holes. All right, now that all the holes are plugged, we actually have access to the coil packs. You're gonna have to get this harness out of the way. There's some kind of quasi zip ties. If you push down a little tab, they should come loose, and you should clear the harness enough to be able to get it out of the way. Mine were pretty brittle from being so old. Mine actually did kind of break. I'm not too terribly concerned about it. Then you just got to start disconnecting the tabs from the coil packs. And then once that's done, we can get one of those coil packs out of here. Now, for me personally, I like to keep the coil packs in order, so I want to make sure, the one that was in 1 goes back there, the one that was in 2 goes back there, the one that was in 3 goes back there. So I'm just going to go ahead and leave that right there, and we're ready to get the spark plug out. One interesting thing about this particular GTR is the size of the spark plugs. It's not your standard spark plug size. I actually had to get a 14mm thin wall to get down in there. And actually, it looks like I'm going to want a longer extension. And there it is. So one of the things I'm going to teach you how to do is after this, you're going to want to take these out and make sure you put them in an area where you can see which spark plug came from which cylinder, because I'm going to show you how to read the spark plugs, and then that way you're going to know what's going on with your engine. All right, so now's the time to put the new spark plugs in. The spark plugs, it seems like most GTR users are these NGK DILK AR8, A as in Apple 8. And this just seems like the standard that everybody gets. Now, usually when you do spark plugs, you're going to want to gap your spark plugs, but because these are iridium, they came pre-gapped at the proper gaps. So you don't want to gap these because there's a coating on the electrodes, and if you knock that coating off, they're not as effective. So before we put this sucker back in, you always want to hit it with a little bit of anti-seize, otherwise there is no way in hell you're going to be able to get this sucker out in the future. So you just put it right onto the threads. I like to use a pretty good amount. You're fine as long as you just don't hit your electrode area. You definitely don't want to do that. Once you have the anti-seize on, it's ready to go back in. So you just load it up into your spark plug socket and you feed it all on in, and you want to do this hand. You do not want to start torquing on this thing before it's seated, otherwise you could strip your head, and that's really expensive. Now, the interesting thing about this particular engine is I'm used to putting spark plugs onto a specific tightness. According to the manual, you get this sucker as hand tight as you can. You put on the socket wrench, and it's literally a 90-degree or 1/4 turn, and you are torqued. That one didn't actually feel right. That one felt right. So once that's back in, I just find I put everything back together so the coil pack goes immediately back in where it started. That way I know it's the right coil pack. I put the bolt back in. Now here again, when you do actually wrench on this, you don't want it too tight because you are dealing with aluminum, and you do not want to have to replace this. All right, so that's one spark plug done. I'm just gonna go ahead and do the rest, and I'll catch up with you once all the spark plugs are in the engine. Just as one little additional note, I did say to put the anti-seize onto the spark plugs. I also like to put a little bit of anti-seize on the bolts that hold the coils, because you know that area is still getting hot as well. So I figure for the next time I do the oil change, it's not a bad idea to have anti-seize on these bolts also. All right, so all the spark plugs are in, all the coil packs are back where they're supposed to be, and all the clips are plugged into the coil packs. So we're ready to get going. We're gonna put the intake manifold back on, put everything back together, and see how this car runs.
Now it should be trouble.
Yeah. All right, so at this point, I'm actually not going to torque anything yet. I'm just gonna get them seated. So that's basically where the bolts just basically barely make contact with the manifold. And then I will show you the bolt pattern and tell you the torque specs. Okay, now that all the bolts are seated, now we're gonna start actually tightening them down. This is where I said you needed the inch-pound torque wrench, because it is only done to 108 inch-pounds. The foot-pounds would just be too much, and there is a specific pattern for tightening these, which is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And I will, of course, put that up on the screen for you to see a little bit better. All right, so I'm gonna begin torquing these down to 108. However, when I start doing this, I don't go first to 108. I actually set it at 100, and then I go back a second time to 108. It's just something I do to make sure I don't over torque. As you can see, I turn, handle clicks, time to move on to the next bolt. All right, now that all the bolts are torqued down to 100 foot-pounds, I'm gonna put this where it's supposed to be, which is 108. And I will go around one more time. All right, so intake manifolds all torqued down to proper specifications. Now let's try to find all the hoses and clips and get everything all hooked back up. So hooked up, hooked up, hooked up, hooked up, hooked up. Hooked up, hooked up, hooked up. Yep, okay, cool. There we go. So one thing I did that kind of helped is I loosened the disc clamp right here. All right, so I think we got everything hooked up. I think we got all the sensors clipped back in. I think we got all the hoses hooked up. So before I put the cover back onto the intake manifold, I'm gonna hook up the battery and fire up the car just to make sure everything's working like it should. All right, see if this sucker fires up. All right, fired it up. Everything seems to be running okay. Just time to put the cover back on, and then I'll show you how to read your spark plugs. All All right, so like I said earlier, when everything was all done, we were gonna go ahead and talk about how to read the spark plugs. For those of you who know how to do this, at least you saw how to do the spark plug change on the GTR and you're good to go. For those of you that are more new to doing spark plugs, this is gonna be very important because it's gonna tell you about the health of your engine. When you look at the electrode part of the spark plug, you wanna look at the color. If it is a bright white, that means you're running lean and that is a seriously bad thing for the engine. If it comes out black, that means you're running rich. Doesn't mean it's necessarily extremely bad for the engine, but running rich robs you of horsepower. And if you're extremely rich, too much fuel can actually start corroding some of the parts, but that's pretty rare. The big issue is you don't want to be white. So as you can see here, I have them laid out based on how they came out of the car. So passenger 1, 2, 3, and driver's side 1, 2, 3. Ideally on electrodes on the spark plugs, you want a nice dusty brown. Now, if you look at this one, it's a little bit on the dark side, which is okay. That means I'm just running slightly rich. If you also look at the gap is a little big, but it's not huge. I kind of suspected that these spark plugs were pretty old. The guy who had the car before me didn't have any records about what he'd done to the car as far as maintenance, and I didn't trust him. That's why I'm doing the spark plugs now. So this one was a little rich. This is the number 2. If you're looking at it, this one looks a little bit better. It's still a little dark, which means it's slightly rich. It's fine. This one right here is the ideal color. It's a nice dusty brown. That's what you want to see. That pretty much tells you that you're getting the proper air-fuel mixture. Here again, the gap is looking like it's a little bit long, but like I said, I think they've been in the car for quite a while. We go over to the other side. Same story. So this one is looking a little bit dark. It's not as dark as on the passenger side. It does have that nice kind of dusty brown color for the most part, so that's pretty good. The number 2, this one also is looking fairly decent. Also a little dark, slightly rich, but most cars run rich from the factory anyways. Now this one, this I think was a problem. I'm gonna show you. If you take a look, if you remember the other ones, what the gap was like, look at the gap on this one. The gap on this one is huge. I thought I might be having a slight misfire issue, which is why I did the spark plugs. I'm pretty sure this is the culprit right here. So hopefully that means now that when I drive down the freeway and when I'm having some fun in the canyons, I won't be getting that slight hesitation, but only time will tell. And there we go. We have successfully changed the spark plugs on the R35 GT-R. I hope you liked the video. If you did, go ahead and hit that thumbs up button to let me know. It does help the channel out a lot. Tune in next time as I continue to do maintenance on the car, but it's also technically my first upgrade. I'm gonna do the brakes on this car all the way around. I've ordered up Speed by Design rotors, pads, and steel braided brake lines, and we're gonna do all that as well as a fluid flush. It's gonna really help the stopping power of this car, and you won't have to worry about the issue that the stock rotors have, and I'll talk about that next time. If you have any questions about this video though, or you feel there's anything I missed, go ahead and post in the comments section down below. I will respond to you. If you want to see more GTR content in the future, go ahead and subscribe to my channel. You can also follow me on all forms of social media, which include Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, and I'll leave links to those in the description down below. I thank you all for watching, and until next time, forget everything else, focus on the finish line.